In this lesson, we'll introduce JSP Standard Tag Library, or JSTL. Web technologies like to use so-called custom tags. This is an example in ASP.NET. In this example, a custom tag ASP text box is used to generate a text box, and the ASP button tag will generate a button. Notice the difference between this tag and the standard HTML tags like the p tag. And this is an example of custom tags in CodeFusion, which is a web technology developed by Adobe. And this is an example of using JSTL tags. In this example, we have a custom tag out, which simply prints out a string. Let's see how it works. This is the hello JSTL.jsp. Noticing the custom tag out or cout here. And if we run this page, it simply shows hello world in JSTL. And notice that the generated HTML source only includes the output of the tag hello world in JSTL. This is a simple example, but it shows a couple of important things. First, notice the use of the taglib directive. In JSP, you must use a taglib directive to declare a tag library before you can use the custom tags in that library. This is like in Java code, where you must import a package before you can use the classes in that package. Secondly, notice the two attributes of the taglib directive, URI and the prefix. A common misconception about the URI attribute is that it's the URL where the taglib can be downloaded. It is not. It's just a name or identifier for the tag library. The naming convention for tag library URI is to use this URL form. And the main purpose of that is to make sure the URI is unique. As for the prefix, it's just a shorthand form for the tag library that can be used in the JSP. For example, here it says the prefix is C, so the tag cout means the out tag in the C tag library. In theory, you can use whatever prefix you want. For example, you can use prefix ABCD, and the tag simply becomes ABCD out. In practice, when it comes to JSTL, people usually use C as a prefix for the core tag library. And speaking of JSTL, here are the 5 tag libraries included in the JSTL. The first is the core tag library, which is the one that we'll use the most. Another tag library that we are going to use quite a bit is the SQL tag library. The other tag libraries are also quite useful. For example, you can use the XML tag library to parse XML documents and generate XML output. You can use the formatting library to format dates and numbers. And the function library provides lots of string functions that you can use to get the length of a string, get part of a string, and so on. And most importantly, here's the URL for the documentation of the JSTL tags. Keep it handy as you'll reference the documentation quite a lot. JSTL tags are pretty straightforward to use. After all, they are just tags. So instead of going through all the tags one by one, we'll use a couple of examples to show how to use them, and then more importantly, how to read the documentation. And once you understand what those attributes, attribute types, and so on means, and once you know how to read the documentation, using these tags are no more difficult than using regular HTML tags. So, as for the examples, we'll revisit a couple of examples we did before. The first one is the login logout members example, where we'll create a login page and we'll use login to protect a members page. And then we'll revisit the guestbook example, but this time we'll rewrite it in using Java Beans expression language and JSTL. And we'll use these two examples to see how these three JSP components, Bean, EL, and JSTL, work together. Let's start with the simpler example, the members login logout example. Let's say that we first create a members page, and we are going to create it as a JSP page. So it will be members JSP. And this page will show that this is members only area. Now, with that, we have the members page, but it's certainly not protected in any way. So how do we protect that members page? Well, we know how to do that in servlet. And if we go back to here, for example, so in the servlet, we display the page itself, which we have here. And then in order to protect this page, we want to check a session scope variable called user and see if the user is null. So this one obviously need a if statement. So where do we get a if statement in JSP? Well, that's where JSTL comes in. The JSTL core library provides a number of tags, and the more important of these tags are those flow control tags. These tags provide some flow control statement like features. For example, cif tag, which is like an if statement, choose when otherwise tag. This is like a switch statement. For each, it's like a for loop, and for token is another form of for loop. In addition to this flow control tags, it also provides tags to create new variables, remove variables, specify certain URL, redirect, import some page, specify certain parameters, print out, and even catching exceptions. So a quick glance of this text tells us that we probably want to use this cif tag. And once we know that, go over to the documentation and see what this cif tags requires. So notice the attributes section. It says that this cif tag has 3 attributes, and the only required attribute is this test attribute. And the type of that test attribute is Boolean, and the description says a test condition that determines whether or not the body content will be processed. Okay, so that gives us enough to start, and we'll do something like this. So here we'll do check if there is a session scope variable user, and if not, redirect to login.jsp. Okay, so well, before we can use for the if tag, let's copy over the tag lib directive. Okay, so test something here, and then redirect to login.jsp. Okay, so first, this test part. Notice that the type of that test attribute is Boolean, and in HTML, everything is a string. So if you say test if true or false, and this true is simply a string, it's not a Boolean value. So where do we get a Boolean value? Well, this is where we use expression language. Expression language provides the data types that are not strings. For example, here we need to check if something exists or not exist. In this case, we'll check if there's a session variable user exists. And if you remember our discussion about expression language, operator we can use is empty, and this empty operator will check whether the variable is either null or empty. So we can do something like this. This basically says if this user variable is empty, then do a redirect. And here we can do a little bit more. So we specify a user variable here, and what happens is the application server will then look for the user variable in all the scopes, including application scope, session scope, request scope, page scope, until it finds a variable in one of those scopes. Here, we want specifically to look in the session scope to see if there's a user variable in the session scope. And one thing we can do is we can say session scope dot user. So this specifically says that this user variable should be in the session scope. Now this may look a bit strange, but if you remember the implicit objects we discussed when we talk about expression language, notice that these four objects, page scope, request scope, session scope, application scope, are among the so-called implicit objects in expression language, and this is how we can use them. We can say some scope and then dot, then variable name, and that should return the scoped variable in that particular scope. So what this one says is that if there's no user variable in the session scope, then we do a redirect. So how do we redirect? Well, again, we go back to the JSTL tags, and in the core library we see this redirect tag. So go to the redirect tag documentation. It says there's something called a URL, and this URL is a string. Okay, so that means we can do something like this. We'll say C redirect URL, and the string is login.jsp. And this is more or less it. Notice the difference between the string type and the Boolean type. As I said earlier, everything in HTML is a string. So when you write it like this, it's just a string. And if you want some non-string data type, you'll have to use expression language. So the key thing about using JSTL tags or custom tags in general is to understand where you need to use expression language and where you just need a string. And once you understand that, using those JSTL tags is really as easy as using the regular HTML tags. Okay, so this should be more or less it for our members page, and let's quickly check it out. So if I do a refresh, and because there's no session scope user variable, we should be redirected to the login.jsp, which we haven't created yet, but that's okay. And it is redirected. Oh, it is redirected, but because there's no login.jsp, it actually goes to the for error page, and that's okay. So let's create the login.jsp. So this is login.jsp, and here we of course need to have a form, and this form will process the login, and that will be the login page itself. And the method, let's say the method is post, and we'll have username, and then we'll have password, and then we'll have a login button. Okay, so this is our login page. Okay, run name is login.jsp, login.jsp.jsp, and okay, so this is our login page, and right now it shows a form of 2 fields and nothing else. Again, going back to our original Java code, let's see what we need. What we need is to display the form. We already have it here. And then we need to process the form. In the process part, we have an if statement to check if the request variable username and password equals to CYSUN and ABCD. And if they do, then we set a session variable, and then we send redirect to the members page. Otherwise, we simply show this page, and which is this display part. Okay, so as we can see here, once again, we'll need to do an if statement, and then redirect, and then something in between. So let's get the tag lib, and then let's do the if statement. We say check if request from username and password, and we'll say if, and then we say test. Okay, so here we need to test the request parameter username and password. So how do we do that? Again, remember the discussion about expression language. How do we get the parameters? We say param.parameter name, and so we can say param.username equals to CYSUN, and param.password equals to ABCD. And if that's the case, we do a C redirect, and URL would be members. So this example shows how we can again combine the elements from expression language with the JSTL tags, and the result is like a mini programming language that we can do some coding inside the JSP. Of course, this one only let us to do the check and the redirect. We need to do one more thing, and that's set a session variable called user. And that's something we can do with another JSTL tag called cset. And if we go to the documentation for cset, we see that there are two attributes here. One is called var, and that's the name of the variable, and the value attribute is the value for that variable, of course, and the scope variable, its scope attribute is the scope for the variable, and of course we would want it to be session. So with that, we'll have something like this. We'll say cset, the name of the variable, no, it's called a var. The name of the variable, we'll call it user. The value of the variable would be CySum, and the scope of the variable is session. So this should do it. Check username password. If yes, redirect. If no, continue to display the rest of the page. Okay, let's give it a try. So we go back to our members. Notice that after we go to members, it automatically redirects us to login.jsp. If we give the wrong username password, nothing happens. If we give the right username and password, it sends us back to the members.jsp, and member.jsp checks. Now there's a user variable in the session scope, and now it shows. And we can also do logout, and normally to log out we would want to call a session.invalidate, but in this case we don't want to use JSP scripting elements, so instead of invalidating the whole session, we'll write a logout page that simply removes the session scope variable, and that we can do with cremove. And the code is pretty straightforward. So let's create a logout page. Notice that for logout, there's no display. After we remove the session scope variable, we immediately redirect the user to the login page. So there's no need to do any of this. There's no need to try to display anything, and all we need is the tags. So we'll say here we do a cremove, and to see cremove, the attributes are var and scope, so we specify the name of the variable to be removed, and it's to be removed from that scope. So we'll say remove var, which is user, and then scope, which is session, So once it's removed, we immediately do a redirect, and the redirect user to login JSP. And that should do it. And we can add the logout link here. We'll say logout. Okay, so let's go back to the members page. Logout goes back to login. If we go back to members page again, redirect us to login again. Yes. So as you can see, with expression language and JSTL, we can do some simple programming in JSPs, and it actually simplify coding quite a bit comparing to using servless. And in this example, the key thing is, as I mentioned, understand when to use expression language as an attribute value and when to use just simple strings. Besides the documentation, you can also read about some of the examples included in the notes. For example, in the notes, we have things like some examples for cset, cif, cremove, and so on. Okay, so this is our first example, and let's look at another example, and we'll do a guestbook example, but this time we'll use only Java Beans expression language and JSTL. In order to make that work, we'll have to simplify things a little bit, because after all, using expression language and JSTL to program is still quite limited. So what we do is we'll take the original guestbook entry class, and we'll create another version, and this version will be a little bit simpler in the sense that we no longer use ID as an identifier for the entries. We'll use the indexes like the very first version of the guestbook we did. But with that said, I'm also going to add a date field in there just to show how to format date using JSTL tags. So this date field will serve as a timestamp field, and whenever a new entry is created, it will create a new timestamp with the time when that entry is created. So let's add the getters and setters. So now we have three properties: name, message, and date. And since we are going to use expression language and JSTL, there's no way to create a list of entries inside a JSP page. So what we do is we're going to create another bin called guestbook bin, and this guestbook bin will serve as a bin, and it will hold a list of guestbook entries. It will be something like this. It will have a list of guestbook entry, or in this case guestbook entry 2, and we need a constructor that takes no argument, so that we can create a bin like this in JSP using the JSP useBin tag. So we'll say entries new array list, and that will be guestbook entry 2. And for testing purpose, we'll create a couple of entries. So we'll say new guestbook entry 2. Actually, let's do it this way. No, this should be okay. And let's say John says hello, and Jen says hi. Okay, so we have 2 entries in there, and then we create the getters and setters. Okay, so now we have our bin. So with these 2 bins, we can now create our guestbook page. So we'll call it guestbook.jsp, and we need to create a guestbook bin here. So it will be called GB. The class will be J320 model guestbook bin, and just like the real text guestbook in example, we'll put it in application scope. So if you remember our discussion about the useBin tag, what this one does is it will create an object of guestbook bin by calling the constructor here, and then it will place that object inside application scope so it can be shared by other JSPs and servers. So with that, we go to the display part. So in the display part, we want to create a table, and for each entry, generate a row in the table. So table is simple enough. We'll do table, and then we'll do the first row of the table will be a header row. We'll say name, and then we'll say message, and we'll also say date. And then the problem is, how do we create the rest of the rows, and one row for each entry, and that of course requires a loop statement, and again there are loop tags in JSTL that we can use. So go to the documentation, see for each, and here are the attributes. The attributes we'll be using are these 2, items and the var. So items, as you can see, is an object type, and what it is the collection of items to iterate over, and the var is the name of the exported scope variable for the current item of the iteration. So what that means is we'll say C for each items. Remember that if it's not a string, you need to use the expression language. So what the expression language are we using? Well, we need a collection of items to iterate over. And what is a collection of items? Well, it's GB dot entries. So that gives us a list of guestbook entry 2 objects to iterate over. And so entries, and how about var? Notice that var is a string. It's the name of the exported scoped variable for current item of the iteration. So it's a string for the current item, and that gives us a variable called entry. So for that, we can do another row, and for each row we'll say entry and then dot name. So why can we do entry dot name? Because entry is the current item in each iteration. And what is the current item? Well, the current item is an item in this collection, and it is of guestbook entry 2 type. And guestbook entry 2 itself is a bin, and it has 3 properties: name, message, date. And that's why we can do entry.name and then entry dot message and entry dot date here. And this should do it. Let's see if it works. We go to guestbook.jsp. It shows nothing here, and that is weird. Let's see, where did I do wrong? Oh, so if we do a view source, and notice that view source shows those custom tags directly instead of showing the HTML generated from those custom tags. So when you run into this problem, and I'm sure you'll run into this type of problems at least once or twice when you do your homework. So the first thing, just like debugging any JSP, is to do a view source. And we'll see C tag shown directly inside the generated HTML source. You'll know that those custom tags are not properly interpreted on the server side. And what that usually means is, it usually means that we forgot to declare the tag library. Notice that there's no tag directive here. In fact, Eclipse actually shows a warning here, says unknown tag 3 for each, because we haven't imported the tag library. I ignore that warning, thinking it's another false positive from Eclipse. Not a wise decision. So let's import the tag library, and now Eclipse understands the C tag, and if we refresh, now we can see the entries. And if we do a view source, notice that the HTML content should only include the content generated from the custom tags, not those custom tags directly. Okay, so this is the basic usage of the C for each tag. Again, there are some additional examples in the lecture notes. For example, this is for each tag that uses the begin, end, and the step attribute. And this is like a for loop in Java where you'll say I equals to 0 plus plus I less than certain size, and so on. And this is more Java for each type of loop, and this is a regular for loop with start and end and increment. And there are a couple of things I want to add to this example to enhance it a little bit. The first thing is I want to show the use of the var status attribute, and this is actually something quite useful when you want to use the indexes of the list that you created. Reading the documentation itself may not be very clear. The documentation said name of the exported scoped variable for the status of the iteration object exported is of the type Java X servlet JSP something something loop text status. So the type is string, so that means we'll say something like var status and then give it a name like a status or ABCD if you want, but I will call it status. Now the question, however, is how do we use this thing, because the documentation doesn't really say anything about how to use this. But notice that the documentation excuse me, does give us the type of that variable. And if we search for that type, we can see that that type is once again an interface, but more importantly, there are a bunch of getters in that type. There's get begin, get count, get current, get end, get index, get step, is first, is last, and so on. So just like using any other implicit objects in expression language, we look up the API documentation of that object type, we find the getters, and then we know how to use this. For example, if we want to show the index of each row or each entry, all we need to do is add another column, and then we say status dot index. The reason we can say status dot index is because we have a index property here. So just like that, now we have the index for each row. And if you don't want to display index as a 0 based, we can do index plus 1. So it shows first entry, second entry, and so on. So this status attribute or var status attribute is often useful, and this is how you can use it. Understand that that variable is of this type, and then look up documentation and find what properties this variable has, and then you can simply do status dot property name, and that's that. Now another improvement I want to add to this display is the display of the date. By default, it prints out the date like this, and it's not the most user-friendly format. Fortunately, there's a tag in JSTL that allows us to format the date, and that tag is in the formatting library. It's in this library. So we need to import that library as well. And there are several ways to format date and time using this tag. You can say type is date, so it will only output the date part of the timestamp. Or you can say type is time, it will only output time. And you can say both, it will output both. And then there are a number of other ways to format using the long format, short format, and so on. The most flexible format is to use a pattern, and you can see all the symbols that you can include in a pattern in the documentation for the simple date format class. So for example, if you use a lowercase y, that represents a digit in year. If you use a capital M, it represents a digit in months, and so on. So what this one says is use 4-digit year, 2-digit month, 2 digits for date, and then 2 digits for hour, minutes, seconds, and then print out AM or PM, something like that. For example, what we can do here is we can say entry date, and then we can do a format date, and then format date, and the value is a date object. So again, it needs to be expression language, and the pattern on the other hand is a string pattern. We can say let's do year, 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 month, month, date, date, something like this. And Eclipse once again says unknown. Is it called format date? It is called format date. And we have included the format library. Is it called FMT? It is called FMT. So let's try this. Oh, I misspelled format date. There's no E in there. Okay. So that's how it looks like. So in this example, we have shown the use of the loop tag for each, which is very, very useful. You are going to use it quite often. And we also show the var status attribute of the loop tag, and once in a while you also need to use that, and how to format date using a format date tag, which is in a different library than the Cortex, but still part of the JSTL. Okay, so now we have the display part of the guestbook, and let's see how we can add a guestbook entry. So we are going to create another JSP, and we're going to call this JSP add comment.jsp. And in add comment, we'll have a form, action. Action would be add comment itself, and then method, let's do post. And we'll say your name is say the message is submit button. Okay, so this gives us a form, and we can also add the link to the form here. Okay, so with this form, if I type in anything, it won't do anything because why is going to guestbook? Oh, it goes to add comment servlet. It should go to add comment JSP. So right now it doesn't do anything because it's submitted to this JSP, and obviously this JSP doesn't do any processing yet. So what we need here is we need to take the name and message, create a new bin, new entry in guestbook bin, with the name and message. This seems rather difficult, so we'll have to do a little bit trick with this. Before we do that, let's include the guestbook bin here, and also we'll import the C tag library here. So here what we are going to do is we are going to do a set property name is guestbook, and the property is something, and the value is something. So what we want to do here is we want to create a new entry in guestbook. Now, we know how to do this in Java, which is fairly trivial. But here we limit us to using only JSTL tags and expression language and the Java bins. So without accessing to Java directly, we have to use a little bit trick. So we know that when we say set property something, it simply calls a getter inside the bin. So what we do is we create a pseudo property, so to speak. We'll create a write-only property called set add entry, and it takes a dummy input, and inside this set add entry setter, we'll create a new entry. And we'll add this new entry to guestbook entries. So, in other words, let me stop the server. In other words, this set property tag would invoke this method and creates a new entry inside the entry list. So here, the property would be called add entry. So entry, and the value can be anything because it's not really using the value, so we just give it a dummy value. Once we have that entry, we can set the value of the request parameters name and message to it, and that requires us to be able to access this entry. So how do we access that entry? Well, let's create another property, and that property will call it the last entry. So this one will return the last entry in the list, and that will be entries get entries.size -1. And do we need a setter for that? We probably don't need a setter for that. Okay, so what we want to do here is to set param name and param message to the last entry, and that requires us to revisit the cset tag. So we have already used cset tag in the logging example, and we set a variable, and we set the value to that variable, which is pretty straightforward. Cset also can be used to set bin properties, and it's in some sense a better JSP set property, because when we use JSP set property, the name attribute must be a bin declared by JSP useBin. Cset, on the other hand, can set a property of any object. So all we need to do is specify the object and then set its property. So we can do something like setting the property A of that object to this value. So the object here, or the target attribute, would be gb.lastEntry. Notice that we are not going to set a property for guest bin itself. We want to set a property of the last entry of guestbook bin. So what we do is we say guestbook bin.lastEntry, and that's our target, and the property is the name, and the value, we know how to do that, and that's the request parameter name. So this would allow us to set request parameter name to the name property, and similarly we'll do message and the message property, and that should do it. So let's try this. Let's go to guestbook.jsp, click add comment, and then CY sound says hi, add. I think we didn't do redirect, so let's go back and check. Okay, so it did add CY sound hi, but it also add another empty entry. And the reason is that when we click add comment, it goes to this JSP page, and whether or not that's a post request, it will add an entry anyway, and at that time there's no request parameter name and message yet, so that will add an empty entry just by simply going to this page, and of course we don't want that. A simple way to avoid that is to check whether it's indeed a submit. So we can say if test not empty, and this time we check the submit attribute, which is the add. We say if not empty param add, then we do all these things. So that it will eliminate the first empty entry, and furthermore we'll add a redirect here. So after we set the values of the last entry, we redirect the user back to guestbook.jsp. Okay, so this should be it. Let's go back to guestbook, and let's try this again. So let's one more time, and it redirects back, and notice that this time it's not adding the empty entry. The empty entry was added before, and let's try this again just to make sure. And a third time, no empty entry anymore, and that's because we add a if check here. So here we are checking whether the submission parameter is set or whether it's a form submission. You can also check, for example, whether the request method is post, depending, because the form submission is using a post request. And so this again is a example that demonstrate how to use the JSTL tags together with expression language and together with the Java beans. And admittedly, the way we are adding new entries is a bit tricky and non-elegant. We have to create, for example, a fake setter, and then somehow invoke that fake setter in a JSP page, and that's indeed is a problem. And next time when we talk the model view controller architecture, we'll restructure the code to be much more elegant and more natural and makes more sense. But this example is mainly used for demonstrating various ways to use JSTL and expression language and beans. So stay with us for now. And one more method, one more tag I want to show. It's actually not a tag, it's a function in the function library, length. These are the functions in the JSTL functions library, and as you can see, most of them have something to do with string operation, whether a string contains another substring, whether it starts with something, ends with something, index of certain substring, getting a substring, converting to uppercase, lowercase, and so on. Most of them are string functions, and length, as you would imagine, would be a function that returns the length of the string or the number of characters, and that's indeed one way of using that function. Another way of using this function, however, is to check whether a collection is empty or not, and or the number, it will return the number of elements or items in a collection, and that's often quite useful. For example, let's say that instead of pre-creating a couple of entries, we'll just start with an empty entry list. And so let me restart the server. Okay, it's restarted, and so it looks something like this. So suppose we don't want to show this empty table. We want to say if this entry list is empty, we simply display a message, and if it's not empty, then we display the table. So how can we do that? We'll include the function library in the JSTL, and that is functions. So it says functions, and usually the prefix is fn, and then we say if test fn length GB entries is greater than 0. That means there is at least one entry in the list, and then we display the table, and then we'll say if fn length GB.entries equals to 0, that means it's empty, and instead of displaying that empty table, we simply say there is no message yet. So it says there's no message yet, and if we leave a message, now it shows the table. So what I want to show here is, first of all, you can use this function to check the number of elements in a collection. It's not just used for checking the length of a string. And secondly, notice the difference between this one and the rest of the tags that we've been using, like the C tag or the CIF tag. So the functions tag library is different from others in the sense that it doesn't provide new tags, it provides expression language functions. So this, for example, length is not a tag, it's a function that you can use in expression language. And to use that in expression language, similar to using a custom tag, you have to add the prefix here. You'll say prefix, column, and then the function name, and then the arguments like regular code. But this one, notice that it's not a tag, unlike CIF or unlike the format date tag that we see. So this is a kind of a special case in JSTL. The functions library is not a tag library per se. It provides a number of expression language functions. So that's the end of this lesson, and the important thing is to know how to read documentation. Using the tags, after all, is relatively simple. They are just tags. Understand how to read the API, understand how to read the tag library documentation, and most importantly, understand when to use string and when to use expression language to specify the argument values. And with some practice, it will become more natural and a lot easier to do.